Good morning. For those of you I've not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Lachlan Hay. I'm the Director of Global Operations for CLINUVEL. I've been with the business now for just over 16 years and currently based in Singapore, where not only am I supporting the programs that I'm going to talk you through today, but also working alongside the team in new product development. When we started this program 18 years ago, and I must admit 30 minutes is insufficient to talk through all of it, but we'll see how we go. There were certain indications that we wanted and needed to see to make this program viable. Now, I don't ask you to read everything that's on the slide, but there are two things to which I want to draw your attention. Over time, you get an indication that your approach, your strategy is working. And for us, the two that I've highlighted here are quite important. In 2006, when we dosed the first patients, there was a belief, at least, that this drug could provide photoprotection to EPP patients. In 2010, we really received the first validation from an external body that not only could this drug provide protection to these patients, but they were prepared to pay for it. And so what we saw was IFA, which is the Italian health ministry, providing subsidised but reimbursement for SCENESSE to treat EPP patients. The company generated its first sales. Now, if we fast forward to where we are today, there are other steps in that commercial story that have taken place. But really, this was the impetus for us as an organisation to say, we have a proof of principle. If I fast forward to 2022, where we've gone through an approval process, the drug has been approved in Europe, the drug has been approved in the USA, we are treating patients. We still had a handbrake on us from the regulators, where they were not prepared to facilitate off-label treatment for adolescent patients. I'll come back to adolescents later on, but really in 2022, we saw the first indication from physicians treating these patients saying, I don't care what your regulator says, it is worth treating these patients, I'm prepared to do it. And again, we've seen a government agency, a government body, provide reimbursement for these patients. Over time, we are building and growing the number of patients that are receiving treatment. But every one of these small steps, these tiny details that we announce to you, that we see internally, gives us confidence that we continue to grow this program. Now, this doesn't happen in isolation. You need to build this ecosystem. You need to build the ability to introduce a new technology to the market. Over those 18 years, we've really built that support, both from academia, from the clinicians who are prepared to treat these patients, and from that commercial approach. We now have a huge body of research in terms of treating EPP patients, publications, peer review, that gives us an understanding of how this drug is, firstly, treating these patients, helping these patients, but secondly, now, being used in the real world. 14,500 doses, we have a level of comfort in terms of the safety profile of this drug. And I should say that's 14,500 in EPP patients specifically. We also have long-term data in a growing number of patients. More than 300 EPP patients across Europe and the US have received 15 or more doses of SCENESSE. There are a small number of patients from Switzerland, and in fact, the first 5 patients involved in that CUV10 study are still receiving treatment. But there's a small number of those patients that have received 80 or more implants. This gives us comfort as a company and provides us with a foundation to continue to grow. But without this, certainly where we are today, we would not be in a position to expand the use of this product into new patient groups. Some of you have seen a version of this slide before. Please don't read it. There's a copy of this on the ASX. But I want to talk you through some of the key elements to it. The tube map that I'm providing you here talks you through the complexity of the US market and introducing a novel treatment for US patients. The number of steps and the flow of funds to facilitate treatment for a single patient within the US is incredibly complex. We've tried to simplify it here. But the reality is that in order to get a drug to a patient, the number of steps, the number of individuals, and the number of payments that need to be made are frankly astounding. What does that mean for you as a drug developer at the end? assuming that you follow the traditional path, your margin is being cut by each one of these individuals, each one of these intermediate steps. And so ultimately, if you follow that traditional model, regardless of whether it's orphan or mass market product or large product, you're sitting at the bottom, at the end, receiving a royalty while everybody else takes its cut. We're not a traditional company. And so the thought process for us was, how can you disintermediate this system? How can you arrive at a process whereby you are receiving the revenues for all of your sales? And so this is the simple approach that we've taken. Now, I make it look very simple on paper. The reality is it's quite complex, and I'll talk through some of that in a moment. But really what we've tried to do is build relationships with each one of these stakeholders over time. If I start from the very first studies that we conducted in the US, part of the process that we have to go through as a company is to try and identify where these patients are and who's treating them. And over an extended period of time, build the relationships with the specialty centres that are providing that treatment. So that those centres that are conducting your clinical trials become the centres that are treating your patients commercially. There is an existing relationship over time. The patients, patient organisations, and in the US this is vital to us, but certainly individual patients as well, patient advocates, those who are prepared to talk about their disease. As an organisation, as a company, we try and build those relationships directly. You build your database of patients. Your staff build the relationships with individual patients, understanding how they're using the drug, why they're using the drug, and ultimately that helps you overcome some of the potential hurdles that they may encounter, whether it's from reimbursement, whether it's from geography, whatever those tyrannies happen to be. By having that direct relationship, we can facilitate patient treatment. And payers. The US landscape is difficult. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of reimbursement organisations, both insurance companies, private insurers, but also from a government perspective. And again, your team needs to build those relationships to give comfort that the treatment that you are providing is of value. This is cost effective for these patients. What have we built over the last 5 years? Well, Linda Teng and her team have really established a framework and an infrastructure for us that allows us to treat EPP patients and ultimately will allow us to treat other patient groups. From a small team, we've now grown, so there is an awful lot of support for individual patients, for treatment centres, for introducing the product into the US. So Linda and her team every single day are working with patients, are working with specialty centres to provide treatment. As an executive team, we provide them direct support, working with that team, making sure they have what they need to introduce the product. And ultimately, there are back office roles or perhaps inward-facing roles that enable us to provide treatment to patients. Pharmacovigilance is not necessarily glamorous, but it's important. If you don't know the safety profile of your drug, you do not have a handle over your program. If you don't understand how your product is moving within a country or within a region, you don't have a handle on your product. Now for us, this becomes more complicated because, of course, we've got a controlled temperature product. You need to move that drug at 5 to 8. Under normal circumstances, not a problem. But the heroic efforts of Linda and her team during COVID, for example, to facilitate ongoing treatment for these patients is remarkable. That direct relationship with the centres also means that you have an understanding of how they want to treat these patients. Some of these centres want just in time. They really do want to receive the drug on Monday and treat the patient on Tuesday. Sometimes they want the drug on Tuesday and to treat the patient on Tuesday, but hopefully you get a 24-hour window. Others will order in advance, and so will stockpile product. So understanding that relationship helps you build that commercial infrastructure. Ultimately, this program costs us less than $5 million per annum. We also believe that you can scale this for not much more. And so the intention really is here to build out that team, initially to serve EPP and where we are today, and ultimately to serve larger indications. What have we achieved over time? Growth. The intention is to continue growing the EPP market, and there are avenues for us to do that. Over the period of 2016 to 2023, you've generated more than 330 million in sales. I would say that the vast majority of that has been in the last 30 months. That comprises both your sales reimbursements, so this is the way that we report. This is predominantly the Swiss Special Access Scheme. The rest is commercial, Europe, US, a little bit of Israel. The frustration I think that we have, and particularly explaining this to a market, is that this process is a little bit lumpy. We haven't quite smoothed it out yet. And so the reality is that you're going to have periods which are showing far greater growth than others. And so for us, the first half of each financial year is a slower period, and then you get the growth in the second half of the year as you start seeing your orders come through. Unfortunately, we're not at a position yet where we've overcome that seasonality of disease, but it's coming. So the reality is a lot of these patients will receive their first doses in January, February of the year, and ultimately we'll see 4 or 5 doses throughout the course of the year. And so that is reflected in our sales, is reflected in our revenues. The centres will order in January, February, and then you start seeing your sales come through. For us, and the key message that I want you to walk away with today, this growth is continuing. We've not hit a point where we see any ceiling for EPP at this point in time. The objective for EPP and treating EPP patients in North America was really to try and facilitate treatment access within 3 to 4 hours of where these patients live. If I come back to that initial clinical program, we started to understand that there were clusters of these patients within the US. And so for us, it really was about understanding, okay, firstly, where do these patients live? Secondly, how can we make sure that they've got access to treatment? An EPP patient doesn't want to travel an extended period of time to receive treatment. It's a physical impossibility for many of them. It's not fair or kind to ask a patient to travel 5 or 6 hours to receive treatment. So the idea here was, can we facilitate this clustered approach to distribution? As it stands today, we've got more than 80 centres which are providing that treatment for EPP patients. The intention is to get to 120. I'll come back to that. But the reality for us from a commercial perspective is making sure that these patients can actually access that treatment. The prior authorisation process, which is familiar to a couple of you in the room, but just so that you understand, a patient needs to go to their insurer and receive authorisation to receive treatment. It's a formalised process in many ways, but until the insurer signs off and agrees with the physician to treat the patient will not get treatment. Encouragingly for us, the vast majority of patients who pursue that process of prior authorisation are receiving treatment. It's pretty standard for an insurer to say no first time around. But ultimately, by pushing through that review process, by pushing through that appeal process, these patients are getting treatment. And it's full credit to Linda and her team that we're actually enabling that. More than 100 private insurers are now providing treatment. We also now have patients receiving treatment through Medicare and Medicaid, as well as Veterans Affairs. Now, forgive me for becoming a little bit of a wonk, but I need to talk you through some of the codes that exist here. Some of the challenges that exist in that horrible tube map that I showed you earlier really relate to the ability for physicians to easily provide a treatment to a patient. There are administrative processes that they need to go through to facilitate that treatment. The easiest way for us to assist these physicians and assist the administrators who are supporting them is to make sure that they have the right kind of treatment codes in their systems. A current procedural terminology code enables a physician to bill for drug. It enables a physician to look up in their system and interact with their health insurer and say, yes, this is the agreed reimbursement for this drug. That process goes through an AMA review. There's a specific panel of the American Medical Association. It's a 12-month process to get to that point. J-code goes through a similar kind of process with another part of DHS, and the J-code really facilitates the administration of the drug. You need to make sure that you have these codes, because otherwise the insurers and the physicians are not speaking the same language when they come to bill one another. So this smooths through the process. The nicest thing is, it doesn't just apply to EPP. These codes can be applied to any other indication. So you now have this infrastructure in place, these codes in place, that will enable you to treat other patient groups down the line. Canada is difficult. I think I first spoke with a Canadian patient 7 years ago, and we received a regulatory approval to treat that patient, but no payer support. So while the regulatory environment is very much willing and able to facilitate a special access program, Canadian payers were not on board, were not at the point where they were prepared to accept this as a treatment. And so again, Linda and her team have gone through this process of providing comfort to payers in Canada, and these are predominantly government payers, to facilitate treatment for these patients. And ultimately, the team is now working on a formal filing in Canada. In the interim, it's encouraging for us that we have a special access program. Canadian patients are now getting treatment with SCENESSE. Over time, we need to build this to 120 centres, in part to treat EPP, but in part to address larger indications within the US. So we're still roughly 40 centres off, but the intention is there. 8 years in Europe. Well, it's a bit disingenuous to say 8 years in Europe if I say we started in 2010, but let's stick with 8 years in Europe. Where it stands today, largest number of patients treated in 2023. There are new patients that are receiving treatment year on year. There are new regions that we're moving into year on year. From a patient treatment continuation perspective, again, we see a high rate of patient continuation. What this means is that patients who received treatment in 2022 are coming back and are continuing to receive the drug. Now, that 95% rate, I don't actually have a point of reference here. I might harass some of the analysts in the room to see if anybody else has a number, but the feedback that we get, particularly when I start talking to insurers, when I start talking to payers, they don't necessarily believe that it's a 95% continuation rate. That's too high. That doesn't exist. So for us, this, again, it gives us comfort that these patients are demanding this treatment, these physicians are prepared to prescribe this treatment, and year on year we have continued revenues from the program. Over the course of this year, we've opened 5 new treatment centres across Europe. Some of those are in new markets, some of those are in existing markets to facilitate treatment for patients and trying to reduce that travel burden for them. We're also working our way through label expansions at this point in time to be able to facilitate treatment for a larger number of patients. Now, over time, you learn things about your drug. That's part of the history of CLINUVEL, I think, is over time the environment evolves around us. The scientific understanding of the treatment evolves around us. Interestingly, we've now seen the first paper published out of Switzerland, which looks at the hepatoprotective effect of the drug. So, as a quick side note, EPP patients, as a result of their genetic defect, have a buildup of protoporphyria, this phototoxic compound, predominantly in the blood, but also in the liver. For a small number of these patients, they have severe liver complications. For somewhere between 3 and 5% of those patients, ultimately they will require a liver transplant. By showing that you have a hepatoprotective effect in this patient population, you are showing to the physicians, but also to the payers, that this drug is doing more than just providing photoprotection. It's fantastic that we facilitate a normalized life for an EPP patient. But there is also added value in this ongoing research to show that you have the ability to do other things for a patient population. So there is research ongoing here. I'm fairly optimistic we'll see more peer-reviewed papers in the not-too-distant future, and we'll be able to talk more to payers about the hepatoprotective effect of the drug. One of the frustrations but joys of this program is we get reports back from the clinic that don't reflect our data. The data that we have is solid. We have good clinical trial data. But the patients and the physicians say to us that this drug is life-changing. Now, had you have seen that in an early stage phase 2, maybe early stage of a phase 3, there's a placebo effect, the patients are saying, well, it works for me. Okay, you accept that and say, I take it with a grain of salt. 5 years into commercialization and continuing on from that, to continue to receive these reports from the clinic, again, gives us an indication that this drug is doing for patients and really changing their lives. One of the great frustrations that I have is that we're not yet treating all adolescent patients. If I just walk you through why I say that. As a 15, 16, 17-year-old, you are making decisions in life that will ultimately affect who you become. You're making decisions about friends, you're making decisions about careers, you're making decisions about study. Now, for many of us, we make those decisions with the normal kinds of restrictions that we might have. For an EPP patient, they're making those decisions with the ultimate restriction of, I cannot interact with my environment the way the normal human being would. I'm unable to expose myself to light. I'm cutting off career opportunities because of my condition. So the impact of this disease on an adolescent patient is much more severe than in an adult. Interestingly, many EPP patients will tell you about a severe reaction that they had in their teenage years, whereby at a certain point, I'm 15, I'm 16, I'm invincible, I'm going to challenge my disease. And many of them will have a severe reaction that ultimately forces them to take the kinds of choices with the limitations that they have. We've been working for a number of years now, and I mentioned the first proof of principle to treat patients in 2022. But we're now finding that we have pathways to facilitate treatment for these patients. Off-label treatment in Europe, and certainly enabling physicians to do that. We had restrictions in the past. Regulators did not want to see this. But the reality is now, it's not us as a company, but it's the physicians saying, I need to treat these patients. I want to treat these patients. We estimate across the 4 countries you've got roughly 60 patients that would be treated. You can extrapolate that out as you see fit, but this is a known patient population rather than prevalence data. And as it stands today, we have a phase 2 study, a pharmacokinetic study which is underway in EPP patients specifically. So across 3 different clinical centres in Europe, 28 patients will be involved in that. That's a single dosage study. For those of you who are interested, we can talk about that in greater detail. But the study has started. We expect the first results from that program in 2024. Many of you have written about a competitive set or others who are developing treatments. And so as my last comment, wearing my commercial hat, I just want to give you a bit of context of where we are today. Hopefully, at least, I've convinced you that what we do is complex and given you an understanding that the ecosystem that we've built over 18 years is not one that's easily replicated. What I haven't talked about is really the clinical challenges to get to that point. For 20 years, Michelle Matthews-Roth at Harvard worked with EPP patients to try and treat them with beta-carotene. There's a program with Roche. As it stands today, physicians use beta-carotene in some instances where there's nothing else, but the reality is there is no evidence to support the use of beta-carotene in EPP patients. Cimetidine, an anti-reflux drug, and attempts to repurpose that product for EPP patients. There's no clinical evidence here. The reality is that physicians are really not supporting its use. And then we have 2 commercial programs which are, I'm hesitant to say ongoing, but let's refer to them in that light. This shows you the difficulties of developing a drug for this disorder, for this disease. The Tanabe program, which finished a phase 3 study and seems to now be trying to run a second phase 3 trial, hunting for treatment-naive patients, so the burden is even higher, but the reality is failed to meet its primary endpoint. The program from Disc Medicine, again, completed a phase 2 study. Because of their inability to meet the pivotal endpoint that we use for registration, the comments that have been made publicly are really that we're seeking regulatory feedback. Now, I'm not complacent. The question was asked to me sometime last year in, I think, a room downstairs. What is the odds that you're going to see a competitor? What are the odds that you're going to see a competitor? I'm not interested in those odds. I just want to understand the environment in which we're working and prepare accordingly. But what I would say is that even if these clinical programs are complete, The environment, the ecosystem has not been built. The payer approach is really not there. The distribution model that we've put in place, we've not seen thus far. And so the hurdles that still stand in front of either these programs or any more that come down the line are incredibly high. In terms of where we are today, in terms of what we've built over the last 18 years, we have tried to really come to a proof of principle that you can introduce an orphan disease in an alternative model. That you can disintermediate the system in the US to be able to improve the margin that you receive as a pharmaceutical company. The next step for us is really to take that model, to take that foundation that we've built, based on safety, based on acceptance from your physicians, acceptance from your regulators, acceptance from your payers, and expand that model into new indications. And certainly that's what I now hand across to Dennis to introduce, and we'll be talking about for the rest of the day. So thank you very much.